For years, Sony shooters have been hoping for an APS-C camera with all of the professional features of the company's top-end full-frame cameras, and with the Sony a6700, those shooters have finally gotten their wish. But not exactly. Back in 2013, I was hired to do social media photography and videography on America's Got Talent. The show shoots at Radio City Music Hall, which is a union venue. There's an official union photographer for the hall, and only they are allowed to use professional cameras during shoots. That meant that I had to leave my Nikon D3S and D4 at home, and instead I brought with me a number of cameras that I'd been testing for some magazines, including Sony's NEX5T, which was a 16-megapixel APS-C camera. The NEX5T was so unprofessional looking that I had no problem getting it approved for the shoots. There was no way with a camera like that I was a professional photographer. The photos it took were actually amazing, and that NEX sold me on the idea of mirrorless cameras in general because it was small enough and light enough I could run around Radio City Music Hall following the acts without leaving me exhausted like I would get on a wedding shoot where I'd run around with heavy gear around my neck. Unfortunately for serious APS-C shooters, the size and the shape of the NEX cameras would be inherited by Sony's follow-up a6000 series, although the a6000 did gain a viewfinder and a few more buttons and dials. From an image quality standpoint, though, the Sony a6000 series cameras have always created images of at least equal or better quality to other APS-C cameras on the market, but compared to something like a Fuji X-T camera, the ergonomics are just incredibly limiting. Sony added more features to their APS-C cameras, including real-time tracking, IAF, but somehow having more features made these cameras even harder to use. All of my reviews of Sony's APS-C camera lines complained about the lack of dual control dials, the cramped body, and the tiny grip. While I'd recommend Sony full-frame cameras to people, I never recommended a Sony APS-C camera. The new Sony a6700 changes that, and for the first time, Sony has created a truly usable and professional APS-C camera. It's not perfect, there's some features missing that will annoy real pros, and the ergonomics could still be better. But Sony shooters have been asking for evidence that the company hasn't abandoned the APS-C lineup, and with the a6700 and the company's 23 lenses for the APS-C format, Sony's commitment to APS-C is pretty clear. The Sony a6700 is an absolute beast for both stills and video, and to my mind is a better APS-C camera than anything on the market right now, thanks to the killer autofocus, the great video capabilities, and a design that finally makes shooting mostly comfortable. And it's only $1,400, which puts it in a really sweet spot. The Fuji X-T5 is more expensive and also heavier and bigger. The Canon R7 is $100 more expensive and about 200 grams heavier, and it's still larger than the a6700 as well. The Sony a6700 is full of features, including an autofocus system using the company's newest AI-based technology, like the A7R5 and the Sony ZV-E1 use. When I reviewed the A7R5, and you can find that video up here and in the description below, I said it was odd that Sony's newest autofocus system came first to a high-resolution and relatively slow portrait camera instead of coming to the company's flagship A1 or the sports-oriented A9. Here we are with another camera that has a better autofocus system than the A1 or the A9, at least better at subject recognition, and better at things like finding the eyes of birds, tracking vehicles, and capturing macros of insects. The a6700 is as good at picking out and tracking subjects as the A7R5. Still, a better AF system doesn't necessarily mean that this camera gets more images in focus than the A1, but it does mean that it has the potential to do so. I'll talk about my experience with the autofocus in a moment, but I want to talk first about the design of the body. The a6700 has a 26-megapixel sensor that's backside illuminated, also called BSI, which means it does better in low light than a camera without a BSI sensor, and Sony says that this camera has a 14-stop dynamic range. The a6700 uses a Bionz XR processor and its own dedicated AI processor for subject recognition autofocus. The sensor has more AF points than many other Sony cameras, with 759 points, covering 93% of the area. It also offers 5 stops of image stabilization, which Sony is now calling image compensation for some reason. I've asked them, they don't know why they switched the name to image compensation. The a6700 captures 11 frames per second of RAW, JPEG, or HEIF formats in either mechanical or electronic shutter, and this is one of the things about the camera that I find disappointing. The Canon R7 and the Fuji X-T5 can do 15 frames a second. The processor in this camera should be much more powerful than those two, and I don't know why it can't capture at a faster rate. The relatively low frame rate limits its usefulness for sports and wildlife, which is a shame because this feels like the perfect camera to use on a safari or other shoot like that where you want good gear but you don't want to carry a ton of stuff. There's a 1.5 times crop on an APS-C size sensor using a full frame lens, so that makes something like the 70-200 f4 100-350 equivalent, and the 100-400 ends up being a 150 to 600mm equivalent. The low noise and the good dynamic range of this camera puts the focal length crop in a perfect place for something like an air show or for sports and wildlife, but the 11 frames per second puts it in the too slow end of really useful. The a6700 is virtually identical to the full-frame a7C, which is good and bad. I absolutely love the a7C. It's smaller and lighter than my other cameras, and it's the camera that I reach for when I'm going on a quick trip with my family, or if I'm going somewhere where I don't want to have an expensive-looking camera hanging over my shoulder. We even get an improvement in the a6700 over the a7C. The a6700 features both a rear thumb dial and a front dial under the shutter release. This is something that Sony users with the a6000 and a7C have been asking for forever. Those two cameras have only a rear control dial, which makes using the camera in manual mode incredibly annoying and makes them much less awesome. There's still one really frustrating design choice in the a6700 that comes from the a7C. That is that the viewfinder is on the left side of the body. That means that I can't use the touch autofocus because my nose presses against the display and it moves the autofocus point around when I move my head. Now, this is mainly a problem for left-eye shooters like me, but it also points out another issue I have with the design of the a7C and also the a6700. There's no joystick. Joysticks are less important if you're shooting something that the excellent subject detection autofocus can find easily, and the new autofocus can find a lot of subjects easily. But anyone that's shot a wedding or a group of people knows that the ability to use the small focus point to pick out the specific person you'd like the eye detect to focus on is really essential. It doesn't matter that the camera can pick out somebody's eyeballs. When you're photographing a wedding, you need to photograph the bride's eyeballs. That sounded incredibly weird. The EVF is also not the best on the market, but it's better than on many other a6000 series cameras, and it's more than good enough for daily use with its 2.36 million dot OLED display, which is just about as bright as the A7R5 display, and it refreshes at a very fast 120 Hz. The LCD screen also kind of sucks. It's only 3 inches diagonally and it only has a 1 million dot display. The camera's new updated menu system allows just about any menu icon to be controlled via touch, now including the ability to tap on things like aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, but this points out why there's a problem with such a small display. With only a 3-inch display, the icons on here are really small, and sometimes it's hard to tap on the right one. Often it is hard to see what those little icons say. Which brings me to a complaint that I've had for the last few Sony cameras. After Sony revamped their menu system, a change that literally everybody who uses their cameras have been asking for years, they started to introduce new types of menu. Now there's the main menu, the function menu, an on-screen menu that you can toggle by swiping the screen, and an additional menu that's accessed through the menu button but is different from the main menu, and it looks more like the menu systems on one of the company's Cine cameras. Sony really has to figure out how to streamline this because it makes explaining the camera system really difficult, and sometimes it makes shooting the system even more difficult. The a6700 uses the Z-type battery that powers all of Sony's full-frame cameras, and it gives good battery life for video and for still shooting, but it's not as good as the battery life on something like the a6600. The body also has USB-C, and it uses the fast-charging PD system for powering the camera and charging the battery at the same time. For video shooters, the one bummer is that the HDMI port is not a full-size HDMI jack like the recent A7 series cameras have, but this is another compromise needed for the size, and it's one the competitors make. Like the last Sony cameras, that's also live streaming over USB, and I've used this instead of HDMI to capture some video. The design choice that will likely cause the most discussion is the single card slot. Every time a camera shows up with pro-level features and only a single card slot, the internet goes insane, talking about how no pro camera and no pro photographer should ever use a camera with a single card slot. Feel free to use the comments below to argue about whether single slots or dual slots are necessary in this camera. Features-wise, the a6700 is a beast with the latest Sony technology and specs. Here's a quick look at some of the specs. Let's talk about autofocus. It's a little bit hard to judge the speed of the AI-based autofocus system without a top-end full-frame camera also using the AI autofocus as a baseline. The A7R5 has the AI autofocus as well, but it's a high megapixel camera. It works great for that, but there's again no way to say how much faster an A1 with AI detection would be, since that doesn't exist. The AI system is also in Sony's new vlog cameras, but again, that's not a speedy system. So I can compare the speed and accuracy of the a6700 to the a6600 and the A7R5. I can't really compare it with some of the top top-end cameras like the A1 or the A9. Unsurprisingly, I found the a6700's autofocus to be excellent, although, that said, I also found the a6600's autofocus to be excellent. Subject recognition is improved over the a6600, at least when it comes to subjects with eyeballs or antenna. My son and I photographed a number of animals, including some fledgling red-tailed hawks that took up residence in the parking lot outside of my physical therapist's office. I brought both the a6700 and the a7R5 to photograph them. Both cameras were exceptional at picking out the eye of the hawks even at a huge distance. The eyes of hawks are really tiny relative to their body. I combined animal eye testing with my overheating test, pointing the camera at our bird feeder and letting it rip, and it was great at picking out and tracking birds. Though, on a bird feeder, it's hard not to track birds. Turning towards photographing humans, I had my son ride toward me over and over doing the traditional zigzagging bicycle test. Due to the wildfires in Canada, we were blanketed in a haze of soot, so he was wearing both a mask and his bike helmet. Unsurprisingly, the system locked on his eyes and tracked him continually even through the haze, and even though his face was mostly covered with that mask and helmet. This isn't to say that other Sony cameras or competitor cameras can't do this. Every Sony I've had and tested since the a7 IV and including the a7C were exceptional at picking out animal eyes and human eyes and tracking them. What the AI-based processing delivers is more certainty that a wider range of subjects and more varied compositions will be in focus. I'll even go so far as to say that the a6700 has the best autofocus in the price range, and it's got better autofocus than many full-frame cameras do at well above its price range. However, the a6700 suffers from a complicated system that is hard to set up and control the autofocus. I'm sure this is where it's going, but AI should just know what the subject is, but we're still at a point where you have to tell the camera what the subject is, and then it becomes better at picking out that subject. On the video front, the a6700 captures 4K with full pixel readout, 6K oversampling, and 422 10-bit all-eye. It can also capture 4K 120p and HD 240. For cine shooters, it has S-Cinetone, S-Log3, and can even have LUTs uploaded to it to display during shooting. Active mode stabilization and AI-based real-time tracking and recognition and wide-area AF for movies makes it a fantastic run-and-gun shooter. There's also AF assist, breathing compensation, focus mapping, and pretty much every feature you can find in the A7S III, except the ability to record raw output over HDMI. In real-world tests, the a6700 had decent but not great capture times in 4K 60 before overheating. I got a maximum of about 40 minutes of 4K 60 before the camera overheated and shut off with the high setting on. This was an 80-degree day with high humidity and the camera not in direct sunlight. On a 92-degree day, also with high humidity, I did 4K 60 again, and I got 36 minutes before overheating. People are going to complain that you can't do several hours of 4K 60 422 10-bit in a hot day, but even I wasn't able to spend the whole 40 minutes outside testing the 92-degree heat. I was inside and I left the camera running. For somebody doing full-time studio video work, I would absolutely recommend this as a buy over the ZV-E1. So the question is, of course, should you buy this camera? You get a compact body, a bit of extra reach with your lenses, and usually good quality at a good price. It's a nice trade-off. At $1,400, what you get is one of the best autofocus systems on the market today in a camera that is small enough and light enough to take anywhere. The backside illuminated sensor and the 14 stops of dynamic range means that even as the light starts to drop, you don't end up with noises that are too grainy or unusable. In other words, the backside illuminated sensor makes up for some of the loss in image quality that you would normally see with an APS-C sensor. If you are looking for a $1,400 camera with the best autofocus in the APS-C range and great features, although with some compromises, you cannot do better than the Sony a6700. So what do you think about the a6700? Is this the camera that you've been waiting for? Are you going to wait for a more professional version of a camera like this? Or are you going to use a system from Canon or Nikon or Fuji? Do you like APS-C cameras, or do you prefer full-frame cameras? Let me know in the comments below. If you'd like to see more of my honest reviews, you can do that here. If you'd like to subscribe to the channel, and please do, you can do that here. And always leave me comments about what you think below. For Dave Tries This, I'm David Schloss. Thanks so much for giving this a try.